Great. So yeah, thanks so much to everyone for such a wonderful conversation so far. I really enjoyed all of the different panels. And so today, I guess I'll be exploring environmental histories of resistance to Spanish colonization in the 17th century Philippines. And in particular, I want to show how unfree labor and debt servitude experienced by Philippine communities during the colonial period became some of the main drivers behind mass migration away from colonial settlements and into the fastness of mountain spaces and other zones of refuge. And I was going to spend some time talking about the nature of these unfree labor regimes, but we actually already heard a really fantastic account of the colonial labor landscape yesterday. So I'm indebted to Professor Warren for that. And it means that instead I'll be able to speak in more detail about the response of Philippine communities to the kinds of labor regimes that he was describing in detail yesterday. So I guess in some ways you can consider this as a kind of nice sequel to Professor Warren's earlier presentation. Yeah. So this paper is based on an article soon to come out in the American Historical Review, and it also connects to several chapters of my forthcoming book, which looks more broadly at the limitations of Spanish control in the 17th century Philippines. And you can now order it online with this discount code. So now that plug is out of the way, I guess most people who are at least a bit familiar with the colonial history of the Philippines would be aware that mountains played a particular role as sites of resistance to colonization. And this is particularly the case for the Cordillera Mountains of northern Luzon, where indigenous communities, who were often grouped together under the name Igorot, famously rejected colonization attempts for more than 3 centuries. But what's perhaps less well understood is that particularly prior to the late 18th century, the Cordillera was not unique. So in this paper, I'm going to map the full extent of zones of refuge within the Philippines in this period. And while not all zones of refuge were mountainous, upland spaces presented common advantages across a wide array of geographies, allowing indigenous communities to make use of colonial perceptions of remoteness and the friction of terrain to escape empire. So to make this argument, I'm going to first begin in the Cordillera Mountains of northern Luzon, this famed heartland of upland resistance to colonization. And that will then allow me to introduce the topic, but also to raise some questions about the connections between events in the Cordillera and in neighboring lowland communities, particularly in the Cagayan Valley. And from there, I'll take a look at the same phenomenon of flight into upland spaces in other parts of the archipelago. So firstly, to the Cordillera Mountains of northern Luzon. So the Cordillera Mountain range is vast and impressive. It rises sharply from the western coast of northern Luzon, and it stretches for nearly 300 kilometers from north to south. And early Spanish explorers described these mountains as eerie and barren, with ecosystems of thick tropical pine forests that were often shrouded in dense and humid fogs. Thunderstorms frequently boomed across mountain passes, and fast-flowing streams cut courses down slopes and through rugged ravines. And towering above summits reaching nearly 3,000 meters, peaked above an ocean of clouds, a place where the earth meets the sky. So this region first came to Spanish attention because of rumors of productive gold mines hidden within the mountains, but successive attempts to explore, conquer, pacify, and convert communities were met with fierce and violent resistance. Both Spanish armies and missionaries were consistently forced to withdraw from these attempts, and the Cordillera became a space beyond the colonial frontier, where indigenous communities persisted for centuries outside of European control. Now, the term Igorot is often applied to the indigenous people of the Cordillera, and it's actually a lowland term that means people of the mountains. And it's often been used to group together the multiple indigenous communities who share this history of resistance. But in fact, Igorot territory encompasses 6 different ethno-linguistic groups, and only some of these today identify with the term Igorot. And one group which does not identify with this term is the Ifugao, who are actually renowned as the architects of one of the Philippines' most famous indigenous historical landscapes, the Ifugao rice terraces. And these terraces have long been emblems of the famed resistance in the Cordillera. An earlier generation of anthropologists and archaeologists believed that such extensive terracing could only be the result of thousands of years of indigenous landscape modifications. So the rice terraces were therefore interpreted in this older view as examples of long-term indigenous persistence in the mountains, where communities remained untouched by colonization and able to expand these impressive terraces. But more recently, the archaeologist Stephen Acabado has demonstrated that these rice terraces are actually a much more recent feature. So they were built between the 16th and 18th centuries, and they coincide with a time when Ifugao became a zone of refuge for lowland communities fleeing Spanish colonization in the neighboring Cagayan Valley. So Acabado's findings force a rethink about how the history of Cordillera resistance to colonization unfolded. Mountain communities in the Cordillera were not untouched or isolated from colonization. Instead, they became zones of refuge for thousands of lowland migrants wishing to escape subjugation by the Spanish. But what exactly was driving this mass exodus from Spanish-controlled lowlands? A letter written by indigenous leaders of Cagayan in 1691 gives us some clue. In it, they describe communities overwhelmed by the combined burdens of labor, taxation, and military service leveraged on them by the Spanish colonial state. And these are the same labor regimes that were described in such helpful detail yesterday by Professor Warren. These communities would then look to their upland neighbors who they believed lived without such burdens, and who in turn encouraged the lowlanders to rebel and join them. In the case of northern Luzon, the Cagayan Valley emerges as a particularly important site. So the Cagayan Valley is rimmed on 3 sides by 3 different mountain ranges. And in the 16th century, this expansive lowland plain was both fertile and populous, and so the valley seemed an obvious place for spreading Spanish colonial power. But despite this, the multiple communities of Cagayan all repeatedly and violently resisted colonization attempts. And this made Cagayan one of the most unstable of colonial frontiers for much of the 17th and 18th centuries. And particularly early in the 17th century, colonization attempts were accompanied by frequent violent rebellion that preceded flight into the mountains to evade colonial control. And the choice of which mountains to retreat into differed from community to community, as demonstrated very broadly here. In many cases, lowland communities had existing trading relationships with these upland neighbors. Pardon me. And these relationships would have facilitated their integration and cooperation during times of rebellion. Upland ecologies were rich in meat, honey, wax, resins, and precious metals, including gold in the Cordillera Mountains, while lowland communities produced common subsistence items that were harder to access in the mountains, things such as rice, salt, iron tools or weapons, and manufactured goods. And these trading relationships were established for both sedentary communities like the Ifugao and semi-sedentary or nomadic communities, such as the Aita of the Sierra Madre Mountains, who had temporary camps in the rainforests and lived off bow and arrow hunting, trapping, fishing, and foraging. And the presence of Spanish colonizers in the Cagayan Valley shifted these trading relationships in several ways. In the first instance, lowland communities began introducing swords, firearms, and gunpowder into the mountains, along with iron, farming tools, and other goods that helped to aid the resistance of upland groups against Spanish colonization. And rebellious groups like the Gadang brought with them knowledge of Spanish weaponry, including firearms, lances, and shields, when they moved into these upland communities. And so this fundamentally shifted the balance of power between uncolonized communities and Spanish military expeditions, who often relied on the assumption that their firepower would scare indigenous people into submission. But obviously, when those communities started accumulating their own weaponry, including guns, this was no longer the case. At the same time, the Spanish themselves facilitated this trade. So in the 1680s, a network of newly established Spanish forts became focal points for the trade of goods into unsubjugated zones. Goods such as tobacco, wine, salt, iron, and clothing that were shipped to Cagayan for soldiers in those forts were instead confiscated by corrupt military commanders and then funneled illicitly into unconquered and fugitive communities in exchange for wax, gold, and other mountain products. Now, some of these migrations may have been temporary, so just long enough to wait for Spanish soldiers or missionaries to retreat, but a more permanent migration flow was recorded into the lower half of the Cagayan Valley, into the region that the Spanish called Itoy. And this region was known from the 16th century onwards to harbour fugitives and to provide military support for communities in Cagayan who were in uprising against the Spanish. And so as the Spanish pushed further into the valley in the 18th century, these migrants made their way into the foothills of the Caraballo Sur and Cordillera Ranges, and this is what we now see in the archaeological record. So I want to show you now how we can extend this story beyond northern Luzon. Using the colonial archives, we can map the extent of zones of refuge across the whole of the archipelago. Throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries, dozens of reports described widespread flight, apostasy, and the existence of intractable, unsubjugated zones within upland spaces across all of the Philippines. And in these regions, missionaries and soldiers were regularly confronted by flight or violence, or both. These reports cover multiple geographies, and they begin shortly after the Spanish occupation of Manila in 1571, and they rise over the course of the 17th century. And this suggests that flight into the uplands escalated in response to colonization. So what emerges is a picture of widespread flight into upland areas, resulting in significant impacts on colonization efforts in almost every part of the archipelago. So in the Visayas, this impact was felt more deeply as the 17th century progressed. Although the Visayas were the first place where Spanish colonists arrived in the 16th century, Jesuit annual reports document the slow progress of Spanish colonization across this region, and they were hindered by a chronic shortage in available priests and also the remoteness of much of this territory. Islands like Negros and Mindoro lacked a sustained presence of priests, while on other islands, mission sites were restricted to very specific small settlements with large areas lacking regular interaction with priests. And at the same time, these reports show that the more missionary efforts increased, so too did acts of fugitivism, apostasy, and attacks on Spanish settlements. In the mid-17th century, several major episodes of rebellion and flight also took place in response to forced labor levies. In spaces like Camarines and the Bicol Peninsula, flight away from Spanish settlements and encomiendas was also a common response to forced labor, taxation, and the requisitioning of agricultural products. Fugitives gathered in their thousands, not only in the remote corners of this peninsula, but also in uncontrolled communities that developed on the outskirts of the main Spanish settlement, Nueva Cáceres. From these sites, fugitives regularly raided and attacked the Spanish town and its surrounding agricultural supplies. And Spanish attempts to organize counter-assaults on fugitives were hampered by the fact that most of the allies that they wanted to recruit into their armies were in fact relatives of the fugitives and obviously didn't want to do any harm to them. On the island of Luzon, flight was similarly recorded across a wide array of regions from Pangasinan and Pampanga to Laguna de Bay and Tayabas. And perhaps this map is the most surprising of all of these maps of zones of refuge, because it reveals the widespread use of local geographies to escape Spanish colonization in the regions that were closest to the seat of Spanish power in Manila. Most of the territory covered by this map was home to populations who have long been considered loyal and peaceful subjects of the Spanish, participating more or less willingly in Spanish colonial labor and agricultural regimes. And this map tells a different story. No, not all of these zones of refuge were used as permanent retreats. So in some places, fugitives retreated into forested alcoves that surrounded volcanic mountains like those shown here. And some of these mountains were dedicated spaces where communities could retreat to practice non-Christian religious customs outside of the watchful and often punitive gaze of Spanish missionaries. So despite a perception that the Spanish maintained military superiority over indigenous communities, encounters within upland spaces were often more evenly matched. Indigenous communities were able to use their detailed knowledge of local terrains, seasonal weather patterns, and ecologies to their advantage in these encounters. For both missionaries and soldiers, difficulties in navigating through rugged and unknown terrains often presented the first barriers to reaching remote or fugitive communities. So, for instance, the progress of military expeditions into the Cordillera Mountains was slowed by paths that ran through reed beds and over fallen trees, as well as sweeping rains, thunder and lightning, and great fogs that would cloak the mountains. Ignorant of local flora and fauna, military commanders often perceived the mountain environments as hostile and barren, and the need for constant supplies of provisions into mountain camps made permanent occupation of those spaces impossible. I realize that I've messed up my slides, but I'll go on. So our communities also conducted surprise ambushes on Spanish soldiers, and they would, for instance, hide skilled archers in trees or craggy outposts, and they could use narrow passes to force the Spanish into defensive battles. And agricultural practices also facilitated community evasion of the colonial state. While for some communities, this meant refusing to grow taxable staples like rice, in regions in remote mountains like the Cordillera, the opposite was true. So, for instance, in Ifugao, large-scale wet rice agriculture was a response to expanding populations and facilitated political consolidation, which allowed the Ifugao to muster an organized response to Spanish military incursions. So these insurgent ecologies of Philippine mountains helped to make them successful zones of refuge. Over time, the Spanish came to the realization that conquest of these spaces would only ever be possible through a massive investment in force and violence. Missionaries, who were often the most impacted by raiding and mass flight, became the most vocal advocates of violent methods of conquest, and they argued for the militarization of zones like Cagayan, Camarines, and the Zambales Mountains, the burning and destruction of farmlands and gardens among mountain communities, and hanging the bodies of fugitives and rebels along highways as a warning to others. They also actually frequently argued for the reintroduction of Indigenous slavery. And in some provinces, Indigenous elites were offered the opportunity to take captive fugitives as their slaves in reward for their participation in these punitive expeditions. By the end of the 17th century, many agreed with the Augustinian Fray Diego de Jesus when he argued that fugitive, apostate, and autonomous communities would never hear the voice of God without first having heard the thunderclap of the arquebus. That's a quote. But despite these entreaties for escalating frontier violence, the Spanish consistently lacked the military requirements to undertake these missions. Throughout the 17th century, they suffered from a chronic shortage in soldiers and were forced to choose between these multiple frontiers of conquest and rebellion. So just finally, to conclude very briefly, these histories of flight, apostasy, and zones of refuge demand a new reflection on the limits of Spanish sovereignty within the archipelago. Despite claims to widespread successes in establishing encomiendas and converting communities to Christianity across Philippine lowlands, Spanish control was often limited to coastal and riverine outposts that were easy to access and supply. As elsewhere in the empire, missionaries made attempts to reduce the largely dispersed Philippine population into these settlements, but the limits of Spanish control within the interior of most islands presented ample opportunity for individuals and communities to simply move away from Spanish settlements. And so this history challenges us to look back on the early colonial period, not as one of steadily unfolding or enduring colonial control, but rather as a period of chronic instability and colonial advance and retreat that created only a patchwork empire. Thank you.